Hello, I'm Tony Kay. I'm the editor of Eureka Report. Welcome to Property Point. And I'm joined again today by Nerida Conisbee, Chief Economist of RBA Group. Thanks, Nerida, for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Today I wanted to have a chat about the Reserve Bank's recent Financial Stability Review report which came out, talking about the Australian property market. So what were some of the key things which you gleaned out of that report?
Well, I think that the overall message was relatively positive. So they were happier with the way conditions were compared to 6 months ago. So they're happy with the way banks are lending. So I think that's important. They think they're being a lot more sensible in the way that they're lending. They're also reasonably comfortable with the housing market, which is surprising because there has been a lot of negative media about what's happening in the residential sector. But certainly the Reserve Bank seem fairly comfortable with what's happening. A lot of variability across the country, though, obviously. Yeah. So Sydney and Melbourne very strong from a housing perspective, but on the flip side, we do have a lot of problems still in Perth.
Yeah, I guess so. In the low rate environment that we're in, you know, there's some level of comfort there for the Reserve Bank at this particular point in time. You know, in terms of the ability of borrowers to service their debt levels.
Absolutely. So that was one of the other findings, that they said the average mortgage holder is 2.5 years ahead in their repayments. So, you know, that's a pretty long time period for people to be ahead in repayments. But they did specify that there is a lot of variability across the country and even within capital cities. So, but you know, on average, it is looking fairly positive from that perspective.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the red flags which they raised again was in terms of the apartments markets, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. Yeah,
look, there's no doubt that apartments is worrying a lot of people, and it really is because we've never seen this level of development occur ever in Australia, particularly in areas such as Melbourne. So Melbourne's seeing around 20,000 apartments either under construction or with planning approval. Melbourne typically adds around 1,000 apartments per annum. So, you know, if you're looking at, you know, fourfold from what it's historically added. So it's a lot of new apartments. Sydney, I'm less worried about. So the data coming out on Sydney apartments is far less negative. You know, obviously there'll be some places that we may see oversupply, but on average, I think Sydney has been undersupplied for housing for such a prolonged period of time that the level of development is about appropriate. Brisbane, though, again, is challenging, like Melbourne. So Queensland in total isn't challenging, but for apartments, but certainly Brisbane is pretty challenging at the moment.
Yeah, I live in Melbourne, as you know, and much of the attention is focused in on what's happening in Docklands and the South Bank area. But there's a lot of apartments going up all around Melbourne, multi-level developments, side-by-side townhouses in different areas. So I suppose it's still quite a fractured market. Do you see that most of the concern is more about what's happening in the inner city apartments area?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, when you have a look at the level of development, it is primarily an inner city issue. So with that, we've recently developed the RBA Group Property Demand Index. And when we have a look at areas that are high demand, low supply, they do tend to be areas that are sort of inner suburban or primarily inner suburban, but certainly not CBD. So even East Melbourne came out as an area that's high demand, low supply, but certainly Melbourne CBD didn't come out of that. I think too there is a change in the way that people are living, and there is an acceptance of apartment living and living in smaller dwellings. So that in Sydney has been going on for quite some time. I think Sydney people are quite used to living in apartments, but Melbourne people haven't historically. But that is really changing, and you know, it is a sign of an evolving, growing market.
Yeah, and we talked about the property demand index last time, but let's just do a bit of a recap on some of the key things which came out of that.
Yeah, so with the property demand index, we are seeing very high demand levels on our site in Melbourne and Sydney, not so much in Perth. So quite consistent with what's happening in price growth, that we are seeing really strong price growth in our two major capital cities. But Perth, I think, you know, we did see a bit of an uptick in April, but has since come down.
Yeah. And what were some of the other highlights from the Reserve Bank report?
Well, I guess it was mainly that they were comfortable with what was happening. I mean, apartments was a big red flag that they're monitoring with interest. One of the interesting things, they did some modelling on what the impact of a really dramatic drop in apartment demand would have on banks in particular.
Right.
So they found that if there was a 45% drop in apartment prices in the key areas, places like Melbourne CBD, the banks would lose around $1 billion. So huge impacts, obviously, but also huge drops would need to occur. So, we don't typically see prices dropping by 45% unless there's a dramatic shock to the system. So probably the best example at the moment where we're seeing a big drop in prices is in the UK. So Brexit has led to a lot of uncertainty in that market, and we're continuing to see price declines. So until that uncertainty is resolved, until people are very sure what's going to happen to the economy or what's going to happen politically, that market will probably still continue to fall. So, when we do have really terrible declines in prices or really big declines in prices, it does have to be something pretty major. That leads to lots and lots of uncertainty or very high levels of unemployment as well.
Yeah. The Reserve Bank seems also to be fairly comfortable with what the banks have been doing in terms of their lending levels, and we know that they've scaled back on investment property lending in terms of the amount they're going to lend. So that seems to be keeping things on a reasonably even keel at this point.
Definitely. So the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority have been very hard on the banks, and they've been hard on them for quite some time, and that is flowing through to the amount that they're lending. So they have put a cap on the growth in credit lending to investors. So most Australian banks, for example, won't lend to offshore borrowers, and they have been a lot tougher in terms of who they'll lend to locally as well. So they've got blacklists, so occasionally you'll see in the media blacklists of where banks won't lend or will be very restrictive on their lending. So it is getting tougher for investors, and that's primarily because the APRA and obviously the Reserve Bank and the government is really trying to control the amount of lending going ahead.
I suppose there's a lot of external factors going on too. We've got the US election coming up. We're not sure what's happening with US interest rates as well, so there's quite a bit of uncertainty.
There is a lot of uncertainty. So, for example, if the Federal Reserve in the US increase interest rates, and that takes a lot of pressure off our dollar. So, there's lots of things that can happen externally that will make a difference.
Yeah. Well, as always, it's a great pleasure to have you in the studio with us and to talk about what's going on the property market. So, thanks very much, Nerida. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Tony Kay. I'm the editor of Eureka Report, and we'll see you next time on Property Point.